The Lord of the Rings, one of the most successful fantasy series of all time. I have to say one of the most because it's technically not the best-selling ever anymore. That hurts a little bit. But anyway, I have never actually officially reviewed these three books here on the channel, which is surprising to me. I actually thought I had. I even remember doing it, and I probably just deleted the video. It's intimidating, if I'm being honest. Reviewing The Lord of the Rings is like taking on the heavyweight champion. It's just like, oh boy, what can I say here that hasn't already been said? What can I contribute to the conversation that not everyone already knows? And that's why I'm going to take on a specific agenda for this video. I'm going to be talking about how The Lord of the Rings compares to modern fantasy trends, how we've evolved as audiences, what sells best, and is it still enjoyable to a reader who didn't know what it was, somehow, picking it up and diving on in. Basically, if you spent your fantasy life reading things like Dresden, maybe some of the indie guys, Martin, a little bit of Sanderson, would that somehow detract from the experience of Lord of the Rings due to the fact that you're reading essentially the disciples before the master? Now, I'm not going to make some basic-ass observation that's just not true that so many people love to say, like, epic fantasy's dying. No, it's not. There are still tons of epic fantasy series that sell like crazy. I'm going to be talking about more specific storytelling details compared to how this was written and how things are written now, and judge whether or not a modern reader coming into it would love it. But before we do that, let's talk about what exactly The Lord of the Rings is. The Lord of the Rings was written by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it tells the story of a fellowship taking a magical ring to its destruction to prevent a Dark Lord from regaining his power and conquering Middle-earth. Sounds pretty straightforward, but we'll get into that more in a minute. It was actually written as almost a afterthought, if I'm going to drastically oversimplify things. First, Tolkien created a new language. Then he decided this language needed a world, and hey, why not populate that world with a story? Specifically, when speaking on his inspiration for Lord of the Rings, Tolkien said, "What I think is a primary fact about my work, that it is all of a piece and fundamentally linguistic in inspiration. It is not a hobby in the sense of something quite different from one's work, taken up as a relief outlet. The invention of language is the foundation. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first, and the story follows." While Tolkien wanted it to be one book, the publisher decided to split it into three: The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. There might be one person in my audience who didn't know that, but with the extraordinary level of success and just cultural zeitgeist you're gonna pick up most of Lord of the Rings from just references in day-to-day life, yeah, everyone here knew what I just said. I also realized on my most recent reread of Lord of the Rings how difficult it is now to separate PJ, Peter Jackson, I call him PJ because, you know, tight like that, separate PJ's vision from Tolkien's. Like, he did such an extraordinary job adapting it. It's hard to even find art that's been made since then that isn't clearly heavily influenced by Peter Jackson. I really enjoy going and specifically searching for not Lord of the Rings movies influenced Lord of the Rings art. Not because I have anything against the movies, they're some of my favorite films ever, but I just like seeing different interpretations of Middle-earth. And that's going to lead to the first point we're going to be talking about in this review, the world building and lore. So right now, your typical classic high fantasy world isn't the biggest, most trendy thing. Even all those epic fantasies I just mentioned don't rely on all the elves, orcs, goblins, and halflings, because you can't use Hobbit, that's a specific Tolkien thing. That being said, the world here holds up to this day and is maybe still just the best realized ever in terms of lore. Because, you know, Tolkien decided to write a Bible. We don't need to get into that. You all know about the Silmarillion. Moving on. And just in these books, though, we have the greatest fantasy world ever conceived. And there's many reasons for this. Tolkien didn't write 5 other series in his life. He didn't create tons of other worlds. He spent a lifetime building this world, and it is reflected in the pages. He has honed it. It is just like laser precision. It's the level of detail where he's answered like every question a person could have about how things came into existence to where we are now. We know the conception all the way to the conclusion of the existence of Middle-earth. From the godlike figures that still walk around to this day, some of which are characters in this story, to the day in the life of a halfling. Tolkien has set the bar for the entire concept of world building for modern Western fantasy, and it's still something authors are striving to reach. Granted, they've decided to focus on other aspects. Other authors focus more specifically on history or the current political landscape, and they can pass Tolkien in that one area. But in terms of totally overshadowing his accomplishment of Middle-earth, I don't think someone's done that in every category simultaneously. It just probably can't be done, unless you're willing to dedicate your entire life to realizing a landscape and developing the languages and, the mountain ranges and the look of different architectures. He just went a little crazy. But does that mean modern audiences are gonna love it? Well, that's just kind of something we can't really say, because there's just a specific split that's always existed among fantasy fans of the people who are here for the huge worlds and those who don't necessarily want that. Do you want a Malazan scope achievement of world building, or would you prefer something a little faster like Greenbone Saga? But for those fantasy fans who love their huge epic worlds, this is going to hold up and probably not even show the slightest bit of rust or age, because it's what a lot of the big guys who are still trying to craft huge worlds are looking to and pulling from. Now I have to do the thing where I put a number on the Lord of the Rings world building, and that's hard. 10 out of 10? Is that appropriate? I probably feel like, yeah, it is, because it's Lord of the Rings world building. But I'm actually going to cut in here for one quick moment to talk about tone, because I feel like it's one element to Lord of the Rings that's not quite talked about enough, and upon subsequent rereads has begun to stand out to me more and more. And that is that Tolkien has one hell of a way to craft a tone. Yes, it's just a natural part of the world building as well, but he utilizes a couple shifts throughout, especially Fellowship, that almost inform the reader on just how big this is going to be. Getting into the Shire for the first time, it feels very quaint, it can feel almost like cute, but by the end of the Lord of the Rings, the feel of the words, the impact of the story is entirely different. And I attribute that almost entirely to how well he just kind of slowly cranked up certain features, certain words, certain bits of pacing to overall make this story just grow on you in the best way possible. It feels small, and then all of a sudden it blows up to the point where you're no longer in this fairy tale-esque kind of cutesy vibe. You are feeling the impact, the weight of Middle-earth. But now we're going to fall into more difficult categories to cover, because a character is going to be controversial for me to talk about Lord of the Rings. There are characters in these pages that have just transcended fantasy, even just like literature, and they are just icons of pop culture. You know those names, you know who they are, even if you've never picked up a fantasy book in your life. But as they are written in the pages, do they hold up to what modern fantasy audiences are looking for? Well, for a couple reasons, maybe not. There is a clear trend in modern fantasy of focusing a lot more on the human side of characters. There's not the stoicism that exists for characters here like Aragorn in the most popular modern fantasy characters like Kaladin. Kaladin suffers from depression, he has a lot more anxiety, he fails repeatedly at times. There's this, we want to be able to relate to even the great protagonists who are taking on the world angle to the modern genre that just didn't exist here. Modern fantasy fans have shown a clear inclination in getting as deep as they possibly can into characters' heads and just trying to understand their insecurities, their flaws, and how they can overcome them, rather than these characters who, while they may have moments of weakness, still present themselves as rather stoic overall. And I think many modern fans who have that clear, strong preference for that style of character writing would have a pretty hard time finding the same level of relatability, though there are still characters that have that appeal. Well, let's just look at Frodo and Sam. They have a very human, well-defined relationship. The way they interact you can relate to, and the relationship building within Lord of the Rings I actually think holds up pretty stupendously. But that stoicism could be a pretty massive turnoff. So the characters within Lord of the Rings, despite some coatings of rust that do exist there, I think would generally hold up, and I'm going to still rank them an 8 out of 10. Because no, Aragorn's not going to have a long discussion with you about his anxiety on taking the crown. A lot of the actual, in the movie, Aragorn angles where he seemed more hesitant was an invention by Peter Jackson to make that character more relatable. In the books, he's pretty gung-ho about getting that crown back. Though I will say, Tolkien was well ahead of his time when looking at the ramifications of a journey like this on someone's mind. There was the time taken in these books to show the ramifications of going on on this grand epic adventure are going to take a toll on someone, something that was not seen again as well done as it is here for decades. I think people forget just how far ahead of its time Lord of the Rings was. Like, yes, it set a new standard, and a lot of people tried to reach that standard, but there were so many of the smaller details of his craft that people wouldn't even fully realize were elements that made it great, I feel like, for many years to come. Lord of the Rings also, like, single-handedly proved the viability of selling adults fantasy, so you can thank him for that as well. Retake, and now plot. This is going to be one of the biggest hurdles for Lord of the Rings to have to overcome in terms of appealing to a fresh-faced, baby-looking modern audience. I just think there's certain things here that kind of find the overall blend to be maybe super appealing or revolting to a younger audience. Originality. So in its time of being released, Lord of the Rings was hyper original. Not necessarily its core elements. We've seen things like Dark Lord with evil army being taken down by magical item, all the way back to like mythology. Like, that's not the new angle of Lord of the Rings. It's the nuance, it's the detail, it's the world building, it's the journey itself. Some people write off Lord of the Rings as simple questing fantasy, and while I think that label applies, I'd drop the simple and add exemplary. It's just so unbelievably well done, and questing fantasy has the trope of just being used to show you a beautiful crafted world by an author pretty much because of this story and how well Tolkien set that standard. The pacing, though, is different than what you're going to get right now on the cutting edge of what's coming out. Things now move and move and move, and this halting that Tolkien does to just have a poem, I know for a fact based off my comment sections in the sub-20 crowd, is seen as just a repugnant feature. You'll appreciate it the more you get into it, I promise. So while Tolkien was never as original as some people claim, they kind of talk like he came up with the idea of inventing fantasy, which is just not true, he certainly had a brand new way of telling this kind of story, and the ripples of that are still being felt to this day. The issue, though, is if you're a young reader, you've probably seen these tropes and cliches, and so going into this story, predictability becomes a factor, and you're going to be able to call a lot. And that's assuming you've somehow not already picked up the majority of the story just through cultural osmosis, which, if we're being honest, you have, because your parents showed you the movies, because hopefully they're good parents. To any parents in the audience who have a child over the age of like 13 they haven't shown Lord of the Rings movies to, why? Genuinely why. We also have the presentation of action throughout Lord of the Rings versus the movies, which I think a lot of people will come to expect. The Lord of the Rings does not hyper-focus on detailed action, and Peter Jackson actually made some of the sieges more high stakes and, threatening than what we get in the books. Now, I'm not saying Tolkien does not write extraordinarily beautiful action. He no doubt does. It's more that he's focused on the beauty of his writing during the action than making the reader feel like the party members are going to die or the siege is going to be lost. And I think that's why we actually saw Jackson make certain elements happen within these grander battles or smaller fights to feel like there is more of a threat. A prime example of this is going to be something that actually takes place pretty much between Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers. Yeah, the Fellowship of the Ring book actually kind of ends in like the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring movie, and the Two Towers picks up kind of while that's happening. This kind of also falls into more of that strange pacing it occurs. As I said, this was originally written to be one book. Well, in the movie, this feels like a very intense confrontation with orcs that have been built up to be antagonists, a hunting party that's been haunting them. They've been haunting them in the books, but you don't feel this connection. And the fighting itself is honestly not really written. We more just get offhanded comments about like, we fought them. Oh, and Boromir is dead. I'm not kidding. There's really no writing of action between the orcs and the party in book one, aside from mentioning the fact that they are in the area. And in the Two Towers, Boromir's dead by page 2. So if you are someone who needs that Sanderson-style heroic showdown, brutal action page to page, you may not get the level you expect from the impression given on the movies. It's more about the poetry and the beauty of words even in those scenes. I want to maintain, though, when it comes to battles, Tolkien writes them gorgeously. He just doesn't have a focus in the way a lot of authors today do, where it's about the experience on the ground with the characters in the chaos. It's not really a spoiler because everyone knows how the series ends, but if you want to see what I'm talking about and you haven't read these books, go read The Battle of Pelennor Fields. It's surprising how it's presented, and I think there is a great value to Tolkien's style, but again, it's not going to be what you expect if you've only read modern fantasy. One area, though, that I don't think Lord of the Rings show a day of aging at all is in its applicability. Yes, Tolkien came out with this whole I don't like allegory thing, but he also simultaneously does endorse applicability. And I think the themes, the messaging, the heart, the blood of this story, the what you take away from it, shines as bright as ever, and that just comes down to he's hit on a lot of things that are timeless. Ramifications of war, love, friendship, Christian stuff that's still in our culture to this day. That was Tolkien's bread and butter, especially his ideas around the advancement of mankind, the destruction of nature, industrialization. There's a lot there we've just seen come to reality, so maybe it's even ripened instead of aged. I cannot stress enough though, the pacing can be jarring, but especially to younger audiences, if you're revolted by the poems, just try to get through them. There's beauty in there that you will appreciate the more you get into it. So yes, if you boil down the plot of these books, it can seem simplistic and rather straightforward. The enjoyment comes from the fact that Tolkien is going to use this excuse to bring you through his world on a magnificent journey, and he set a standard for doing so. I don't think that's going to have as large an appeal though for younger audiences, for newer fantasy fans, as a lot of people think. If you're just into the boom pop pow action with the cranking up of character depth and humanity while cranking down more of the just slowly spending a minute to enjoy a poem, the narrative's gonna bother you. Plot won't hit you like it once would. So unfortunately through this lens I have to only rank it a 7 out of 10, and it pains me to do so because removing this lens it'd be higher, but I know when I give my kids the Lord of the Rings treatment, it's going to be me reading it to them so I can add the energy, the what have you, to make them still enjoy it. Next up, communication with the reader. This is going to be a painful point. Every single person, every single one I have come across who has put down Lord of the Rings has done so because they didn't enjoy Tolkien's writing style. I know. I get it. I understand. Though, I will say, everyone who's pushed past Fellowship of the Ring to the point where they've gotten to the Two Towers, their mind has flipped, and they've begun to appreciate what he's doing. So, if you're having that problem, please push through. I believe in you, you can do it! But I cannot ignore the fact that the writing style of the modern state of fantasy is completely different than the way Tolkien writes. We still have high prose, we still have poetic writing, but This is just a whole other level. This is a book you take poetry breaks in, like, all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes of fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be a blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. You can be in my Lord of the Rings review, it's okay. And not every audience is down to take a poetry break. I am. It's a level of effort in a moment within the text where the author is crafting a piece of art for you that is separate yet integrally tied. I enjoy that. But I'm also not going to dismiss people who go, hey, I'm here for narrative tension. I'm here for a lot more than just writing me poetry for a bit. Okay. That's fine. So acknowledging that, what I'm going to say is it's not as bad as many people online will say. I've heard people claim that Lord of the Rings is unreadable by modern standards. If you find this too difficult to read, that's your problem. Following with his keen eyes the trail to the river, and then the river back towards the forest, Aragorn saw a shadow on the distant green, a dark, swift-moving blur. He cast himself upon the ground and listened again intently, but Legolas stood beside him, shading his bright elven eyes with his long, slender hand, and he saw not a shadow nor a blur, but the small figures of horsemen, many horsemen. It's not a foreign language. Like I hear people talk like it's written, thou est beeth the ringeth bearer. No, it's written in modern English. This isn't Shakespeare. Now, a lot of those same people will turn around and not read Lord of the Rings because they just have this like assumption that it's not for them because they're younger. I've seen especially readers who are still in their teens who are burning through the likes of Sanderson and Weeks, just not bother to go back and read this classic because they seem to have a lot of misgivings about what their reading experience is like. And on top of that, I've seen a lot of even hardcore fantasy fans get into the fact that, well, the movies were great and I'm sure they told the story so that you lose so much. Yes, the movies are fantastic adaptations, but you lose a lot with them. And I would say that this is absolutely still worth a read. My overall review for Lord of the Rings in the does it hold up to modern audiences is going to be an 8.5. Aside from, yeah, you need to be someone who really likes big world building and not mind a lot of the tropes that were popular back in the day, it's still one of the best reads the genre has to offer. There's communication issues, but I just don't understand people who say it's unreadable. Anyway, guys, let me know if this has been an interesting review for you to listen to, or is it just a lot of what you expected in the comments down below. Are you a Lord of the Rings fan, or do you find it to be maybe a bit overhyped? I'm interested in the discussion this video is going to bring about. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Nathaniel Barnhurst. Hope you're having a good one. Peace.